welcome. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
All of you are following Ukrainian politics very closely for many years. How would you assess importance of this election, this presidential campaign for Ukraine and its stance in the world?
Well, even though people may be tired of elections in Ukraine because there have been quite a few, I would say that this election is important. Elections in Ukraine continue to be important simply because of the example that they set in the region. If you remember, in 1994, Ukraine's presidential election at that time shocked the world by being totally unpredictable. And Ukraine has maintained more or less that kind of reputation that that politics is real, candidates are real, the political fight is real. Even though 2004 was very dramatic, 2010 is not dramatic in quite the same way, this election continues to be important, partly because of the region, partly because of the country. However, at the same time, I would say that Ukraine internally needs to continue to improve its election, because I get the sense, and my colleagues here will chip in with this, that the elections in Ukraine still are more or less, you get the feeling that they're elections run by oligarchs and very rich business interests for the interest and benefit of the financial interests, and that the electorate really is not participating quite in the way in between elections that it should.
Do you agree?
I think what's significant about this election is that we don't know who's going to win. The candidates actually have to go out and earn Ukrainian support, and that is something that is not true in most other countries in the former Soviet Union. I think it reflects Ukraine's development in a democratic direction. It means that politics, despite the messiness, despite the frustrations that come with Ukrainian politics, the politics are decided at the voting booth. And that's how they should be decided. Nadia is right that the election has not been perfect. There have been some problems. But on balance, I would take the way the Ukrainian election has unfolded so far over other so-called elections that we've seen in the region.
Do you feel that Ukrainians have a choice in this election?
Absolutely. They indeed have a choice. And I agree with both of my colleagues. It's significant because, as David said, we don't know. Second, there's not been a lot of popular sentiment for radical voices and radical parties, despite the economic and financial situation. And despite some of the broad public disenchantment with the political process, there's no sense or signs of social unrest. This has been a test for democracy, which is very significant and shows the very positive trend lines in Ukraine. But democracy is not just an election, and I think that's where the responsiveness of the political system to people's aspirations is still at issue. And I think going to the polls yet again after quite a few elections in the past couple of years, Ukraine's used that time to demonstrate the strengthening of the institutions and the democratic process, yet it hasn't yet, many of these politicians haven't yet connected with the average Ukrainian voter in a way that mobilizes them and commits them to the democratic system.
Nadia, you already touched this issue a little bit. How does this election differ from previous ones, just generally? I mean, how many differences do we have and do we see?
Actually, I'd just like to pick up a little bit before we move perhaps to that, a little bit on do Ukrainians have a choice. They have a choice. There are 18 candidates running, I believe. However, in the end, the trend that I see there is that there is increasingly less differentiation between the candidates. I mean, this actually may concur with your point that, that there hasn't really been much room for extremists and radicals, because I think in the end we're probably going to end up with the top two candidates probably for a runoff are saying very similar things on many issues. There are some where they're saying slightly different things, but I think the distance between them now is a lot less than it was among the candidates in 2004. So, and for that reason, I think a lot of Ukrainian voters are a little bit disenchanted. Some public opinion polls recently said that for the second round, if those particular two top candidates come out, that like 18% would vote against all, which I think is not necessarily a good trend. But
I do agree, Nadia, with that there is a less stark choice. And I think the Ukrainian voters have an opportunity, have a decision to choose among a range of candidates. It's interesting that the two leading candidates are increasingly similar in some of their policy platforms, and that some of the other candidates have not gotten as much traction. But I do think that's also how it differs from previous elections, and that the choice is less stark. It is fairly predictable where Ukraine will go in the future, and it's not a dramatic change from where it's been in the past months and in the past year, I'd say.
David?
Let me state the obvious, which is in this election campaign, we have not seen one of the leading candidates get poisoned. And I don't mean to be flippant about that, because that had a huge impact in the Ukrainian election last time, and I think was one of the contributing factors to the Orange Revolution, to many people being so fed up with the outgoing government and the representative of that outgoing government, then Prime Minister Yanukovych, who is, so far at least in the polls, the leading candidate right now. And there aren't many people talking about fraud in this election. And so I don't anticipate we will see anything like what we saw in November, December 2004, where people will feel so upset and disgruntled with the way the election is conducted that they will mobilize and go out into the streets and into the squares. I think this is an election that will be decided in the voting booth. It's anticipated by most observers that this will be an election that, once again, Ukraine will show is following a generally free and fair process. That happened in parliamentary elections in 2006 and 2007 and the rerun of 2004. That means Ukraine is developing a pretty good track record on elections. Damon's point is absolutely right. Democracy is not elections alone. And that's one of the problems we've seen in Ukraine since the Orange Revolution, the inability of political forces to come together, build institutions that are necessary, rule of law, those kinds of things, dealing with corruption. And I hope that that's something we'll see coming out of this election.
During the 2004 campaign, European neighbors and Russia played a lot of attention and were deeply involved in resolving this disputed results. Is the attention to this year's election sufficient, and what impact could the level of attention have on this election in Ukraine? I mean, from the West and from the Russia, from the neighbors generally.
I think there is, I think it's fair to say, in Europe at least, a certain level of Ukraine fatigue. With the various elections that my colleagues have mentioned, the previous parliamentary elections that were unscheduled, that came about, the sense that politics in Ukraine is endless, that the bickering that occurs between and among candidates, there's no end to that either. And so as a result, I think the reaction of the West has been largely, give us a call when you're done with your politics. That's not a good position for the West to take, because it's very important for Western Europe, for all of Europe, for the United States, Canada, to be fully engaged. Because we may never reach an ideal situation in Ukraine. There may be parliamentary elections after this presidential election, depending on who wins and what happens. And so if we wait for things to settle down, we may miss an opportunity to have a positive impact.
On the point of Russia, which you didn't go into, I think that there is a big difference now in the way that Russia is approaching Ukraine. In 2004, Russia had its clear favorite and was pouring millions of dollars into the country. It was very visible that there was a Russian presence. There were visitors coming from Moscow to appear with the chosen candidate. This year is very different. There, of course, Russia has its interests, but I think both of the top candidates, at least, have made an effort to cooperate and to show that they're not anti-Russian, that they both have been to Moscow numerous times. They have their own relationships with both Putin and Medvedev, and you get the impression that Russia actually would be okay with either of those candidates, even though one, clearly has more of an orientation toward Russia than the other. But I would say that that's one of the big differences.